Ginas is here, who will also be speaking.
Thank you.
And you let me know when we're ready to start.
Hello, everybody. I'm here, Javiera, but my camera it's broken. So, but I'm here. Just here.
We can start when you're ready. Thank you.
Super. Can you hear me well, or is there too much noise? To see if I need to connect the unidirectional microphone.
There's a bit of noise in the background, if you could.
Let me see. Let me see what I can. Is it better now?
Yeah, that's a bit better. Thank you.
Hold on. Okay, is it better now? Super. And now I can hear everybody. So I think we'll give it a start so that we don't delay the following panels. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today to this session on Just Transition for Latin America from Decarbonization to Transformation. We'll be having this session in Spanish, but I understand there is live interpretation. So if you go on the bottom bar on your screen, you will see the sign for the interpretation. You should click the Spanish to English interpretation. And with nothing more to add, I'll start speaking in Spanish now. Para nuestras compañeras, compañeros y compañeras que se están uniendo.
Everyone that's joining now today, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And today, we're going to be sharing with you the results of this process, a research process about the just transition in Latin America. We'll have Javiera Lecourt, who's the coordinator of just transition in Latin America. We also have Guillaume Nagumo, part of the Salvadines, part of the just transition in Latin America as well. And we also have the Mosaic, who's going to be here with us throughout this presentation. We'll start by explaining what the project is and what we found out. We also leave the space where our participants can share a little bit about the how this project has been implemented and work in their regions, and how we have worked this together and what's our vision in the future. And without further ado, I'll share my screen in order to share with you the presentation prepared for today.
Super.
Perfect.
Bueno, transición justa en Latinoamérica de la descarbonización a la transformación.
The just transition in Latin America from decarbonization to transformation. We'll explain what happened during the last year. In collaboration with Zeus Chile and another NGO, we started a process that through dialogue, we started and launched a collective dialogue, and we explored what just transition is in Latin America, because we understand that this is a concept in dispute, where a lot of groups are starting to appropriate what this actually means. In other conversations, we discussed how, depending on who you are and who people are you aiming at, just transition takes different shapes and forms and meanings. And then there are different groups of people who are trying to appropriate this concept. They're not necessarily at responding to the realities of climate justice. Understanding this, we decided to start a process where we put together different people, groups, feminist groups, trade unionists, indigenous peoples and people from the land, from the countryside. And we started debating about this and what the perspective for climate change are for them. First of all, this concept, as I said before, this is a concept that's in dispute, is a gradient. In this gradient, there are many ways of understanding what this concept means. Understanding reforms that wants to keep the status quo and the reforms that wants to transform society. And between scope and inclusion, we explore and understand different understandings and insights of what a just transition means. And depending on the scope, depending on the impacts and distribution, we differ two groups: the concentrated impacts that can be concentrated or expansive. Understand that this is a wider range of impacts and subjects. And then we have an intention, reform and transformation. Understanding the perspective of inclusion, we have two different branches. We have the recognition, we have two branches inside this category, the representation that wants to include the interested parties in aspects of the transition, representing the interests of the vulnerable groups. And then we have the promotion that includes a wider range of people who are interested in the process of transition, promoting the act of vulnerable groups. And then we have the procedural justice that is divided into participation and empowerment. And empowerment works if we provide the tools to the interested parties so they can carry out the transition within their own territories, so they can advance, they can go forward within their territories towards a just transition. Who are using this concept within the region? How do we find the discourses, Latin American discourses of just transitions within this gradient? This is a project that is looking for a collective understanding. And this is the people who've been working together. These are the people involved in the coordination. We are a regional team, and we also carried out regional dialogues across the just transition. And we have more than 500 people registered and many people participating as well. So why should we speak about just transition in Latin America? First of all, because the understanding that the just transition is mandatory, this is not, this shouldn't be taken for granted. We're in different parts of advancement in different countries. In Chile, for example, we've got a law that is aiming for energetic transition towards 2025. However, in Argentina, the talk about energetic transition has not been talked about yet. There's nothing determined there. There's a historic debt also. In Chile, for example, we have areas called sacrifice areas or zones of sacrifice, where these areas have been severely impacted, and right now it's very difficult to recover from the damage done in these particular areas. Therefore, it's very important that these areas are included. So these zones of sacrifice have the support that they need. We need to overcome the energetic poverty. We have in our country areas that do not have access to the energy. Therefore, we have to implement this just transition towards energy, so we can ensure that they have access to energy. The heart of these just transition is not only the work, but the conflict created in this in the environments that is not considering the realities of the different communities. And as we explain, these are conflicts that are social and environmental conflicts. And we wanted to frame ourselves and go beyond the mainstream speeches that only merely focusing on the needs of the workers. We wanted to also speak about what the communities think. How are they thinking about the planning of this transition? How do they avoid future conflicts? And eventually, there's a very important point that has to do with the importance of the collective participation and also the value of the communities that are most affected. How do we create participatory processes that brings everyone together? The transition, the just transition that we want to ponder, we want to bring forward, says the following. In Latin America, the just transition understands the energetic transition that transforms the relationships of power between the great responsible for the emissions and the rest of the world in order to stop the advance of the socio-environmental conflicts of the territories. Also, we want to promote the process of ecological restoration, the energetical sovereignty, a participative democracy, and the respect towards human rights, recognizing the attention given to excluded social groups and the vulnerables in these regions, such as workers, women, and indigenous peoples. In order to do this, we need technological change towards the renewable sources in order to give an opportunity to transform our economical model. We need to do this respecting the planetary limits, understanding our planet. We need a substantial betterment of the quality of life of people and ecosystems as well. We understand and find 6 principles in this process. This includes the planning and decentralization, the reparation and restoration, equity, the democratization, the sovereignty and determination, and the transformation as well. And now I'll move on to explain what do we mean by this. The opportunities in order to push what's going on in the global south. We need to avoid the decarbonization and dependence on the fuel dependency. We need to plan a local decarbonization and democratic decarbonization based on evidence. We need also transversal strategies in order to achieve these. And this has to be carried out by the institutions. And we need these done by the perspectives of the climate, being climate aware. In order to avoid the decarbonization and the dependence on the technology and fuel infrastructures, we are imposing a moratorium on fossil fuels projects. And we, among other factors, we also want to demand policies that decarbonize the public and the binding norms. We need records that recognizes what are all the factors and identifies all the factors involved in this situation. Once it comes to planning the local decarbonization, we need to implement the strategy followed by just transition. We need to demand of social security that includes social rights. We also look for retraining programs and the insertion into the labor market as well that allows workers to work in a just industry. We need to guarantee the participation and dialogue within the process of transition. That communities are right in the center. And we also thinking about measures of involving the territories and the respect for the environment. This is possible to do. We need to project the participative projects of renewable energies based on cooperative production models. We need an investment in strategic sectors such as renewable sources, recycling, clean transport, and efficient housing. We need to prioritize the energetic territorial order. We need to identify also the capacity in order to avoid the impacts and the presence of mega projects. For example, the water exploitation and the hydroelectric power plants, for example. Now, the transversal strategies, we need to promote the agreement of Escazú in order to advance in the minimum standards that are common in an environmental democracy. We need to understand the position of just transition in Latin America. We need to see this transversally in order to tackle the climatic crisis, in order to move forward with the social movements. And we also need to put the funds in order to achieve these. And these are basically the 6 principles that we have developed and we have identified throughout this participatory research project that we carried out during the first 3 months of the year 2021. And now we'd like to talk about this with people from our team so they can tell us what was their experience with this project and what are the main issues identified about the just transitions in their territories, so they can tell us a little bit about their stories that they're bringing from their territories into this conversation that we're having today, where for the first time we are rising from the social movement that has been articulated in these social premises, so we can create a just climate agenda. Without any further ado, I'll give my word to Javiera Lecoud so she can tell us a little bit more about what she has to say. Javi, the word is yours. Thank you.
Hola a todos y todas. No sé si me escucha, Felipe. Hazme
Hello,
un-
everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me, Felipe. Can you all hear me okay?
Bueno, después de esta presentación,
Perfect. After this presentation, I'd like to carry on with the voices from our regional team who have been with us throughout this the creation of this project. I believe Johnny is around here. If you could maybe raise your hand or something.
Conectado.
I'm not sure if there's also someone else here who's connected. And Kata also is here. But let's start with Kiyomi with this round. So we can address this topic and she can provide us her perspective. Because we are now speaking about the feminist movement. This is the movement that has advanced a lot in recent years and very firmly in Latin America. Therefore, it's very important to include this conversation and this movement in the just transition. Therefore, if you're ready now, if you give me a moment, if you allow me one moment. We're trying to find all we can do, understanding our capacities right now. But yes, I'm ready right now. Sorry, you can tell me now what's your general idea and what do you think about what Felipe said? What would you add and what would you consider the main challenge in the just transition from your perspective?
Para nosotras ha sido muy importante participar, ¿no?, en este proceso de la construcción de un concepto, una teorización de lo que es la transición justa desde una mirada latinoamericana, ¿no? Tomando en cuenta que existen también diferencias interseccionales, ¿no?, que va marcando con las diferencias políticas, coyunturales, sociales, económicas, religiosas y obviamente económicas y de salud, ¿no? De hecho, digamos, para nosotros ha sido muy importante empezar a hablar de transición justa porque estamos también en un proceso de descarbonización o queremos plantear un proceso de descarbonización a nivel nacional porque vemos cómo se está profundizando en Bolivia, ¿no?, un modelo de desarrollo extractivo, colonial, patriarcal, ¿no?, que está generando mayor vulneración, ¿no?, y violación de los derechos humanos en territorios indígenas, comunidades campesinas y obviamente la propuesta también es generar una democratización y eficiencia del proceso energético. De hecho, estamos participando en varios procesos, no solamente en generar estas transiciones, el concepto de transición justa o cómo se vaya poniendo o impactando socialmente en la sociedad, sino que también hacemos incidencia política a nivel nacional, ¿no? Hemos generado y gestado también toda una propuesta sobre nuevos indicadores o sobre los nuevos compromisos a los cuales Bolivia debería adscribirse. Creemos fundamental que el respeto de los derechos humanos es innegociable, ¿no? Y la transición justa tiene que tener una mirada obviamente desde las mujeres, desde las
At
poblaciones
this from the perspective of women, indigenous communities who have been historically impoverished, historically racialized, and historically harmed. So part of the research and participation work that we've done has been to put together evidence of this and as part of a process of dialogue. And it has allowed us to work not only with different areas that have been affected,
proceso de generar energías o
Of
falsas soluciones a nombre
the
de
generation of false solutions, such as the hydroelectric power. And we have
de las áreas protegidas para
the
el
appropriate
agronegocio, ¿no? Para la exportación de carne.
industries and the exploitation of meat to be sent to other countries. And we've seen the opening or the intensification of
minería también en estas áreas.
exploitation and as well as mining in these areas that are meant to be protected. And there's been a lot of resistance from the territories
para que se respete no solamente los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas, sino la consulta previa, libre, informada, que ha sido vulnerada sistemáticamente.
and these communities that have been historically harmed. I think it's also important to point out that at the national level, there are policies for agro-industries and for mining and for hydrocarbon companies. Even in spite of these, and I think it's important to point out that during this pandemic, we need to ask what is the support that communities, indigenous communities and peasant communities have providing to the cities, and how do we as countries acknowledge that we're responsible for the harm against indigenous communities. We are also part of the problem. We are part of the harm that's been done not only to indigenous communities, but also at the level of doing harm to disabled people, of harming women. And we've been consuming resources that are meant for the common good. And I think it's really important to mention this. I want to close this part by saying that there is not a more colonial, patriarchal, imperialistic process other than extractivism. And if we don't do this process without taking into account the processes of decolonization and anti-patriarchal organizing, we can't speak of a just transition or climate justice, and much less of equality and decolonizing. It's very interesting what you've said. Thank you so much. So our other participants haven't been able to participate and join the call, but we're going to expand on what Kiyomi has talked about. Something that Felipe mentioned during the presentation is that just transition in Latin America isn't something that's secure. It's not de facto. It's not gonna, it's not guaranteed. Many countries in Latin America depend on the sale and the production of fossil fuels that continue to be consumed in the global north. So we continue to be a territory of extraction, the extraction of natural resources, and we have a higher dependency. So if we want to advance on this, we need to think about how is the global north going to do this transition so that countries in the global south who depend on fossil fuels can think about other forms of production. So in that case, we can go to the next question, which is Kiyomiya. What are the topics that we should be focusing to guarantee a just transition in our countries? So I wonder if you could focus on not only what we said, but other countries in Latin America. And I want to remind you that there is translation, a live interpretation. So please, can we speak a bit slower so that you can definitely understand what is being shared?
Perfecto, creo que es
Yes,
importante, ¿no? Y algo
perfect.
que ha resaltado Felipe
I think
también
it's something very important that Felipe has highlighted is exactly
humanos, ¿no?
the respect of human rights. We've seen how corporations and governments
desde el Estado también
and the state too
se omite,
has
¿no? El respeto
omitted
de los mismos, ¿no?
respect and following through on the promises that they've made. It's important to say that many territories in my country that are sacrifice zones, which are further being harmed, there is not only an environmental, social impact, but there is a violation of human rights against the ones that are being demanded by the people. There's a lack of recognition that these are territories belonging to indigenous peoples, and they do not have the level of political participation that they deserve.
Que están enfocados específicamente
They are focused specifically on the agendas of development and economies. I think it's important to demand from countries, from states, from governments that they can't generate new development policies without taking into account climate policies and human rights policies. That's a basic point. They are not separate things, they are interwoven. While there is not a certain type of transformation politically, we can't talk about inclusion, climate justice, and the defense of human rights. Thank you so much. Very relevant again. I'm very happy to be in conversation with you, Kim, because I think you give a very global perspective of what it is that we should be thinking about when we speak of a just transition. We also participated in the People's Summit, and we talked exactly about the kind of technological changes taking place, green energy. They aren't transitional. They're actually just one form of energy for another. Transition is actually about the process. And if the process of transition only talks about a change of technology and not a complete change of the energy system, then we won't have a genuine transition. And we have to have the transition centered on respect for human rights, respect for indigenous communities, and for those who live in the territories. It can sound quite complex, but from the perspective of the global south, we believe that this is possible. We heard examples of this. Activists from the front line who were generating the solutions for this from their own territories, new forms of production, new forms of community, and for producing energy, which respect agroecological processes. So the solutions that we've been talking about, and what we should see as a key theme, these solutions aren't going to come from the top. They already exist in our territories, in our communities. And this is what we mean when we talk about a just transition. So we're going to go to the last question now. What are the messages, the key messages that we need to visibilize for a just transition in Latin America? What do you think of this?
A ver, ¿cuáles son los mensajes claves? Creo que hay
Okay,
varios.
so what are the key messages? I think there are several, that we're at a point of no return, which we can't go back from. We are not only betting the futures of other generations on this, but also entire systems of life. We can't keep harming communities in sacrifice zones. I think that's very important to emphasize. And it has to be very clear. There is no just transition without respect for human rights. There is no climate justice without human rights. And this includes the incorporation of the perspective from women, from peasant communities, from indigenous communities in decision making and in political participation, not only in areas that are separated off, but across the board. We have to take apart the patriarchal capitalist system in order to have this transition. And as such, there needs to be not only a social and political will, but there needs to be a will coming from the states, the governments, the authorities, in order to generate a change that isn't only to do with transforming energy, but to promote the democratization of technology and energy. This is access to participation, access to justice. And this has to be connected to, above all, communities which have historically been forgotten or abandoned by the state as a result of the lack of healthcare, education. I think it's important to mention that we are in a process as countries, as a country where the territories are still resisting. I think we have to mention this, that we have to keep defending and supporting the voices of land defenders who in Latin America are being assassinated, criminalized, put on trial. And it's up to all of us to support all of these additional harms that are being done to these communities. Thank you so much. I completely share your view. The first message that we want to give is that here is a possibility for that transformation. Now we're here with Felipe at COP in Glasgow, seeing these negotiations directly, how these leaders, most of all male leaders, there are very few women, how these leaders talk about how we can overcome this crisis. We see that a lot of the subjects that we're talking about here don't have a place there. The respect for human rights, a vision that's, or cosmovision that's a lot broader as to what it is we understand a just transition to be. That point of view hasn't had a place here. So this is the question: who are the people who are going to bring these elements into this discussion? Bring this into these summits that have been happening year after year. How can we bring these discussions in so we can confront the climate crisis in a different way and not do this in the same way that the climate crisis has actually been generated, but do it from a perspective that respects human rights in a participatory way, with participation from the people, from civilians. This is fundamental for climate justice. Without participation, there is no real change. And without that participation, it's not a consultation. There is no scope for sovereignty. We have to make it so that people from these territories can take decisions about policies that affect where they're living. So this conversation has been excellent. So I pass the mic to Felipe. There are two things that I would like to do. I've just seen that Oswer has arrived. Oswer is from Mosic in Peru and has been part of our regional team. I would like to present a bit about the principles that we identify that are necessary to achieve a just transition, and what are some of the suggestions about these decisions, because obviously we approach this from the perspective of research, of theory, but even so, we have translated what we have found to suggestions. And very quickly, I'd like to share some of the principles that we are pushing forward so that a transition is genuinely just. And here you'll see we've got democratization, where we ask that communities in territories must participate in decision making around this transition, particularly in relation to indigenous communities. Second point is sovereignty and decentralization. We want territories to have the autonomy to decide who should produce energy in their territories, and that we want there to be greater advocacy from communities, taking into account the damage that has been done to these communities. Number 4, equity. That there be clean energy that's accessible and reliable in the territories. That there be work for these communities and a redistribution of wealth at a systemic level. 5, a planned transition, that decarbonization avoids the loss of employment in vulnerable communities, that there's a diversity of energy production, finally, the potential for socio-ecological transformation, which is what I mentioned, that we stop using fossil fuels and move away from extractivism, that we diminish the demand for energy, that there be further, that the transition goes beyond the use of renewable energy, that we change the scale and the scale of energy. This is an opportunity for us to rethink the way in which we live and relate to one another, and we relate to nature, and how we relate to consumption. I can see that you arrived, Oswald, so maybe you could tell us briefly, what do you view this as from the perspective of Mosic? What is your perspective on a just transition?
Osver está silenciado.
Are you muted? I swear.
¿Ahora se me escucha bien?
Oscar,
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you. Hello, I'm at COP26, and precisely this topic has been really recurring, of course. We all agree that countries have to follow this transition, as my colleague said. Why? Because we only have until 2030 in order to reduce all the gas emissions to half. If we don't do this, the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius will not be reached. Everyone is quite concerned about this. Therefore, it's very important to demand our governments right now, after this event. We have to start bringing this topic to debate. We need a just transition, and of course, has to be ecological, social, environmental, that integrates all of these aspects. We cannot depend any longer on the fossil fuels. There are many organizations, and they all want to advance in a social, political fight for a just transition. Let's not look at only the dirty energies, as I call it, but let's focus on the extractive industries, because there's a report that says that in the next 4 or 5 years, this tendency, if we follow this tendency, we carry on exploiting the extractive resources, which is very alarming. And apart from going through a just transition, many countries are focusing also on the goal of 2050. And they're focusing it as the capture of carbon as a transitional policy, but this is not acceptable. We need to be speaking about in terms of quick decarbonization processes. We need to focus on the change that we have to do in our corresponding countries. We need to demand in our congresses, in the republics, that those who are in charge of the legislative power, those who have the power to change things, we have to put the stress there. Many people in the year 2030 will be focusing on leaving this behind, all with a tendency towards the transition, and the territorial fights are also going to follow this direction. And these reflections from the Global South show that we're also fighting these fights that are done between the indigenous peoples and the oil industries. Precisely here, we have been witnessing the impacts of certain projects and politics of reactivation have strengthened the exploitation of fossil fuels, and I believe this is absolutely outrageous. And all my colleagues and comrades show their solidarity, and we should keep demanding our governments. We should control our climatic commitments from the state, and we have to demand this transition right now. We should not wait any longer. Let's not think about 2050. 20 and 30 is a decisive moment. We need to do something now. Everything that's related to renewable sources, we have that. The nature is providing this already. But however, the governments are not taking advantage of this at all. And what we're doing today, next year for us, will be the moment to already start kicking off and working towards this direction. Thank you very much.
Justo te iba a dar el paso,
Se
Javi.
acabó.
Thank you so much. What is yours, Javi? Thank you so much, Oswer. We also have some more minutes left, just in case anyone from the public, in the audience today, anyone who's today present here, this virtual session that's allowing us to all be on the same space, and all of us being from so many different countries. For example, Kiyomi is coming from Bolivia, and she's here today as well. I just want to say, if anyone would like to say anything, if anyone has any questions or anything to contribute to this conversation, you are welcome to. So please. Are there any questions or any contributions you'd like to make? If there are not any, please. believe there's someone there. Like
Hi,
to
it's
say
Steve.
anything?
Hello, can I ask a question?
Please.
Thank you. Gracias, Philippe. I'm asking a question about the protocol you've developed, the just transition adaptation plan, or the plan that you made. Would that be translated from Spanish into English? Somebody was bound to ask that question.
So we didn't develop a plan per se. What we did was to find collaboratively, we developed a collective understanding of what a just transition means to Latin America. So essentially what we did was a process of translation that was socially constructed, right? So we translated this concept that comes from the labor movements of the global north into the Latin American realities. And what we did was in that process, develop a series of principles of what is necessary for our territories to make sure that the energy transition that we're going to undergo in the following decades is actually just. We also develop a series of suggestions for policymakers that they can integrate into whatever just transition strategies they are developing, because it is necessary that the transition has principles of equity, has principles of participation, autonomy, and human rights, has principles of planned transition that is not just something that happens from one day to another, but that the workers, the women, the LGBT community has the possibility, have the capacity to integrate into this new economy. Because if we think about, for example, the sacrifice zones that we were speaking about, historically, these sacrifice zones have depended, their entire economies have depended on the extractivist industry. However, now that these communities are going to see the closure of the coal power plants, they are going, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, but also that's got a chance to increase domestic violence. That's got a chance to make it more difficult to access jobs, to access housing for the LGBT community. It's got an issue of autonomy for indigenous people, particularly because their rights have historically been disrespected, right? They do not have the autonomy to make decisions over the territories in most of our region. So what we did was this was the first step. This was the first approach to the strategy of a just transition that we need so desperately in Latin America. With a focus on gender, with a focus on human rights, with a focus on historically marginalized communities. And we're doing it, and if this wasn't clear from the translation or the presentation, we're doing it because it is the moment for us to do it. The just transition is a concept in dispute. We don't know yet how it's going to get executed. In Chile, we're seeing that we're putting together a strategy for a just transition, but that doesn't include any of these principles. So that's why we as civil society are elevating this concept and putting together this series of principles, which we hope in the years to come to translate into concrete actions, to work together with policymakers in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Peru, in Chile, and the rest of Latin America to make sure that they are included into whatever strategy or governments decide to implement. Disculpen el inglés, ahí intenté traducir lo mejor posible lo que estamos haciendo.
Try to translate into English as best as I could. I don't know if anyone else would like to say anything else. Yeah, there's some questions in the chat box, but if you'd like to say anything else, go ahead, Oswald.
Solamente quiero decir algo que estamos
Yes.
haciendo en Perú.
Yes, I'd just like to say what is happening in Peru.
Ahorita estamos en una campaña que se llama Energías Limpias Ya.
Right now we have a campaign that's been launched and it's called Clean Energy Now. And this is going alongside the law and this is going alongside the so-called ecological transition. We're preparing a campaign for next year. So this law could be enacted properly and this could approach these these could be approached to the government so we could go forward, because Peru depends too much on fossil fuels and on the mining, and it has a great impact on the rivers, seas, and the Amazonia. On the other side, there's the idea of changing the constitution aiming for a more ecological, aware constitution, because the constitution today that we have, the same case for Chile, they are aiming, they're doing as much as they can so they can have an ecological friendly constitution. So we are trying to do the same thing in Peru. We need to change the norms so the government cannot find support in the constitution and just find their legal shelter, the legal text in the constitution. This is a process that can serve, that can set an example for many others. Because if we want to change the economical power, we should be understanding and envisaging this from the national perspective, so we can achieve this transition. Thank you so much, Oswald, for your perspective and your contribution. And something you're saying something very important that has been repeatedly mentioned when we speak about a just transition. We're not only speaking about achieving the 1.5 degrees. We're not only speaking about reducing the gas emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. We're also speaking about the social, environmental issues that are generated once we tackle the climate change, climate crisis. We're speaking about the pollution and also the transition that's generated when it comes to changing our technology.
Están haciendo en el chat. Cuando hablamos de esta perspectiva y lo vemos, por ejemplo, desde una
Have been pointed out. When we talk about this transition, the technological change from electrical cars, from being petrol dependent cars, this is a positive change. We want to go for, we want to advance towards this, but what does this imply? This means that countries such as Chile, Peru, Bolivia, that means like there's going to be greater levels, there's going to be greater levels of extraction of minerals that is going to allow this change in the north hemisphere, but this is going to be done at expense of the global south. We're speaking about the pollution of water and the impact on lives. Due to this massive extraction, we will be carrying on being the space of exploitation of the world. We will keep perpetuating this problem until there's nothing else in our countries but destruction. Therefore, we're thinking about posing a tax, and the solution doesn't lie in the technological changes, but in the public policies that allow us implement this just transition in a different way. Not follow the transition as we have been following it now. We need to understand that this should be done in a different way. How in the global south we're going to participate in this climate crisis, and how we're going to achieve the temperature goal, but not in expense of our territories. We're not going to be the space of extraction for the industries of the rest of the world. And this is something that has been raised in the chat. I'm not sure if you like to comment anything else. Yes, what I'd like to say is that the lithium extraction is one of the greatest threats towards change towards the electrical cars in the global north. And a message I like to send, particularly for those coming from Europe and the developed countries, Canada, US, is that right now, from Latin America, we need the support, we need the voices that you can provide in the negotiating spaces, where you can claim to your representatives, to your governments, and explain that this transition actually has a global consideration. let's not start building countries that are getting all the resources in expense of the rest of the countries, so they can have the energetic transition in this particular place of the world. We need to understand that the people who live in the global south, in other parts of the world, in destructive countries, they need to understand that we need a perspective that has to aim to repair the damages that have come after the colonization process. For example, me or people who have European family, we understand how everything is really dependent on colonization. We are in a constant process of decolonization. And this is a process that needs a perspective that's really important to have when it comes to developing public policy, international policies that actually come from the global north, from the North Hemisphere. And this is something that allows us a lot of reflection in Glasgow right now. The space of COP still is a very colonized space where the perspective of support and solution come from the condescending, from the patronizing point of view of the system that is thinking of a relief solution. But the reality of things is that today we are experiencing the environmental disasters that we have always been experiencing. We are living this today in the global south because the history of the world led us to suffer this, because the developing countries have developed themselves from the exploitation of the south. Therefore, it's very important that people here today are colleagues, are comrades, sisters and brothers from Europe, from the US, the imperialistic countries help us to raise our voices and expand our voices, so their plans of just transitions actually consider our realities that come from the global south. And that's what I like to say. This is my contribution. Totally. Totally agree. Kiyomi, we have 1 minute left, so we'll be leaving the session, but I'd like to leave you some minutes to have a reflection, final reflection. Yes, I really like and agree with Felipe's reflection, and it's very important to highlight precisely, in order to speak of transition, we need to change the system. This is a structural change, not only in politics, not only in the energetic model, but in terms of structure. How do we perceive other countries and how this is generating certain transitional processes? The most affected are those who live in communities, not those who live in cities. People who don't have access to health, education, energy, and other basic needs. And the only mechanism that they have protection is their resistance projects in their territories that are releasing them, liberating them from destructive processes and impacts. Not only speaking about the global north cities, but also global south cities. Therefore, we all are responsible for what is going on and how these communities are suffering this. We need to work with the nature, with these people, and with their ways of living. Therefore, today we need to demand a just and a rightful transition with the perspective of women and all of us together. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kiyomi. Very strong words, and I couldn't agree more. This is a very colonializing logic. And at the end of the day, with this Just Transition project in Latin America, what we want to do is we want to invite you to start reflecting on this. We need to reflect on how we can just turn things around when it comes to generating public policies in the world, and how we can tackle this climate change crisis from this very perspective. So Felipe, if you'd like to say anything else? Yes, I want to thank the coalition, Kiyomi, Javiera, for participating here. I want to say thank you to everyone who have come here today and who are present today. Thank you so much for participating. And you can access our report on the website. Our page is not working at this very moment, but I hope tomorrow will be available so you can find this report on just transition in Latin America. So I hope we can disseminate this information with your peers and everyone else who can. And I give the word to Oscar who wants to say something. Yes, I want to say thank you so much for the invitation as well. And I just want to say that there's another event tomorrow. There's an assembly for the Amazonia, and this is an event from the Latin American associations. And there's another event that is going to be tackling why some countries have not advanced in terms of climate change. And we are going to be speaking about destructive projects as well. As many of you know, so many governments just sign and say, okay, pass, we agree with whatever they say. And we need to understand what's in there. And tomorrow we'll be speaking about this, and we'll provide an insight from Latin America. And you all are kindly invited. Thank you so much for letting me speak today. Thank you.